At 78, Benny Andersson has started talking about the past with kind of ease he never had before. And recently, he finally opened up about her. Frida Lyngstad wasn't just one-fourth of ABBA. She was a quiet force who shaped more of Benny's world than most people ever realized. Frida wasn't just his bandmate. She meant more to him than most fans ever knew, and he's finally saying why. Why would a seemingly perfect couple fall apart? Career over love. The brutal truth on ABBA's schedule before Benny Andersson and Frida Lyngstad were two members of the world's biggest pop group. They were simply two people who found comfort in each other during a chaotic, transitional phase of their lives. Their love didn't start with fireworks. It started with familiarity. Two musicians who understood each other's rhythms, ambitions, and the strange loneliness that often comes with being deeply creative. In the early 70s, before ABBA fully exploded, Benny and Frida were drawn to each other in a way that made sense to everyone around them. They had similar temperaments. Thoughtful, private, more introverted than the world expected pop stars to be. Where Agnetha and Bjorn had a marriage that was almost constantly in the spotlight, Benny and Frida were more subtle, more careful, more protective of what they had. There was nothing flashy about their relationship. It just fit. By the time they married in 1978, ABBA was already a global phenomenon, and their lives were louder, busier, and more demanding than any normal relationship could easily handle. Their wedding was intimate, almost understated compared to the magnitude of their fame. They wanted it that way. They'd seen what fame had done to Bjorn and Agnetha's marriage, how it wore people down, and they tried hard not to repeat the same patterns. But love doesn't always bend to practicality, and fame doesn't wait for anyone to catch their breath. The real truth is that Benny and Frida's marriage struggled under pressures that had nothing to do with love. Both admitted that ABBA's schedule was brutal. The work never stopped. They were either in the studio, on the road, promoting records, filming TV appearances, or dealing with the never-ending storm of media attention. For Benny and Frida, who were both naturally guarded and sensitive, that kind of exposure was exhausting. When people imagine ABBA during their peak, they picture glitter, smiles, polished performances, and perfect harmonies. What they don't picture are the long hours, the emotional strain, and the toll it took on everyone's private lives. Benny has said many times that ABBA wasn't easy behind the scenes. The band was made up of 4 people who were each fighting their own internal battles while trying to pretend everything was beautiful and effortless. Frida, especially, carried more weight than people realized. Her childhood had been marked by tragedy and instability, and even as an adult, she struggled with moments of sadness that she often kept hidden. Benny, on the other hand, had his own complicated inner world. Quiet, analytical, sometimes distant without meaning to be. He immersed himself in work, because work always made sense. Music was predictable. People weren't. This emotional mismatch, something small in the beginning, grew bigger over time. Frida needed more emotional closeness, more reassurance, more presence. Benny needed space, calm, and the kind of silence only musicians truly understand. Neither of them were wrong. They were just slowly moving in different directions without realizing it. By 1980, the cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. Not dramatic cracks, not explosive fights. Just a slow drifting apart of two people who once understood each other perfectly, but no longer met in the same emotional place. It's the kind of breakup that looks quiet from the outside, but feels devastating from the inside. Their divorce in 1981 wasn't sensational. It wasn't messy. If anything, it was heartbreaking for its quietness. Two people who genuinely cared about one another simply couldn't keep pretending the relationship was working. They tried. But the weight of the band, the pressure, the intensity, and their own personal challenges made it impossible. What made their breakup even more complicated was that ABBA was still alive. They still had to work together, sing together, smile in photos together. And they did. They stayed professional, graceful, respectful, something that still impresses fans today. There was no public bitterness, no media wars, no dramatic interviews. Just two adults trying to navigate heartbreak while standing in front of millions. The real reason they fell apart isn't scandal or secret. It's something painfully normal. Sometimes love can't survive the life surrounding it. Fame, pressure, personal growth, emotional needs, these things quietly change people. And when two people evolve in different directions, even the strongest connection can loosen. Their love didn't last, but it wasn't a failure. It was a chapter, beautiful, complicated, impossible to replicate. And even though their marriage ended, the bond between Benny and Frida never fully dissolved. It simply changed shape. Because some people leave your life, but they never really leave your story. But here's the part Benny rarely talked about until recently. He never stopped respecting Frida. Forever admiration to Frida Andersson didn't really talk about the emotional side of ABBA. He'd discuss arrangements, melodies, mixing choices, or how a certain piano line came to him in the middle of the night. But when it came to people, especially Frida, he always kept a careful distance. It wasn't coldness. It was just Benny being Benny. He's always been a quiet thinker, the one who keeps his personal feelings sealed away behind the music. But now, at 78, something has shifted. Age has a way of softening even the most guarded hearts, and Benny has finally allowed himself to say things he kept buried during ABBA's loudest, brightest years. And what he's saying now surprises even longtime fans. That Annie Frid Lyngstad, the woman many people still call simply Frida, shaped not just ABBA's sound, but his own musical life more than he ever admitted at the time. When Benny talks about Frida today, there's a gentleness in his voice that wasn't always there. He describes her as steady, thoughtful, and someone who understood music in a way that made everything easier. And for a man like Benny, who rarely uses sentimental language, that's huge. He isn't someone who exaggerates. If anything, he's known for downplaying everything. So hearing him reflect on Frida with this kind of warmth makes you realize just how important she really was to him. He often says Frida had a way of walking into the studio and instantly knowing what a song needed. Benny would play a melody on the piano, maybe something he'd been wrestling with for weeks, and Frida would listen, quietly head tilted, taking it all in, and then, almost casually, she'd hum a line or suggest a slightly different phrasing, and suddenly the whole thing clicked. Benny now admits he relied on that instinct far more than people knew. Back then, nobody really talked about these things. ABBA was too busy surviving the chaos of fame, recording schedules, world tours, and the constant pressure of being perfect. There wasn't a lot of room for emotional conversations or long reflections about how much each member meant to the other. Everyone was young, ambitious, stressed, and moving fast. And Benny in particular was the type to sit down and say, "Thank you, Frida, your voice makes my songs better." He just assumed they all understood without needing to say it. But they didn't. And he didn't either, not fully, not until years passed and life slowed down enough for him to look back. Now, he's openly saying things he never said in the 70s. Things like he always trusted Frida's judgment, that he leaned on her calmness more than he realized, that she had a way of grounding the studio when everything felt overwhelming. And, most unexpectedly, he admits that there were moments when he watched Frida record and thought to himself, how does she do that? How does she make this sound so effortless? It wasn't just her voice, although everyone agrees Frida had one of the richest, warmest tones in pop music. It was her emotional intelligence. She could read the room. She could read the music. She could even read Benny, something not many people could do. When he got lost in his head, drowning in chords and arrangements, Frida was often the one who brought him back, not through big speeches or dramatic gestures, but through steady presence and quiet confidence. And now, Benny talks about how much he misses that energy, how he didn't fully understand at the time how rare it was to work with someone who instinctively got what he was trying to express. He says Frida had a way of turning his compositions into something human, something you could feel in your chest, not just here. If Agnetha brought the crystal shine, Frida brought the depth and warmth that made ABBA's harmonies unmatched. What's striking is that Benny isn't just praising her talent. He's acknowledging her influence on him personally. He says Frida made him a better communicator, a better collaborator, and, strangely enough, a better listener, because she wasn't loud. She didn't demand attention. She didn't need to dominate the room. And yet, she always delivered something unforgettable. Now, Benny admits he wishes he had told her more often just how much her presence mattered, not just the group, but to him as a musician. At 78, he understands things he couldn't at 30. He understands that some people enter your life quietly and change everything without making a sound. Frida was one of those people. Even after their marriage faded, something powerful remained between them, something that didn't break as easily as romance. Because if their relationship was complicated, their creative connection was something else entirely. Failed marriage, but perfect on stage while fans often focus on ABBA's hits. The real magic was in how Benny's compositions and Frida's voice intertwined, creating an energy that was greater than the sum of its parts. Their synergy wasn't something that could be taught or imitated. It was born from mutual understanding, timing, and a shared sense of musical intuition. Benny approached songwriting with meticulous care. He would sit at the piano for hours, exploring melodies, harmonies, and chord progressions. For him, the melody always came first, a raw spark that demanded refinement. Frida's role was crucial. She could interpret those melodies in ways that gave them emotional depth. When Benny played a rough piano line, Frida didn't just sing the notes. She felt them, tested them, and adjusted the phrasing to match the emotional tone he intended. This gave their recordings a life and vibrancy that could never be faked. One of the most remarkable aspects of their partnership was how naturally Frida's voice adapted to Benny's compositions. Some singers could perform music well. Others transform it. Frida belonged in the latter category. Her voice could convey strength, fragility, excitement, or longing, sometimes all within the same phrase. Benny often wrote complex harmonies and overlapping melodic lines, and Frida had the rare skill to navigate them effortlessly. It wasn't just talent. It was intuition honed over years of rehearsals, performances, and silent understanding. Their creative chemistry also extended to interpretation. Benny wasn't rigid about how his compositions had to sound. He trusted Frida to make choices in phrasing, vibrato, and timing that he might not have considered. This trust allowed for experimentation in the studio. They would spend hours recording the same passage multiple times, adjusting subtle dynamics, layering harmonies, and testing how different vocal nuances change the emotion of a song. This methodical yet collaborative process gave ABBA its signature clarity and precision, but also its human warmth. What's often overlooked is the patience and emotional intelligence required for this kind of partnership. Both Benny and Frida had to be fully present for each other. A single offbeat note or misplaced emphasis could ruin a take. At the same time, their creative process demanded flexibility. Benny had to listen as much as he directed, and Frida had to interpret as much as she performed. Over time, this created a silent rhythm between them, a musical conversation that needed no words, just gestures, glances, and an unspoken sense of timing. Beyond the studio, their partnership influenced songwriting decisions. Benny would often compose with Frida's range, tone, and strengths in mind. Certain songs were designed to let her voice carry the emotional weight. Others were meant to balance Agnetha's clarity with Frida's depth. This careful orchestration meant that each ABBA song had a texture, a layering, and a precision that kept listeners engaged even decades later. It also highlights how Benny's creativity wasn't just about writing. It was about collaboration, tailoring, and knowing the human element of music intimately. Their mutual respect was evident even in moments of tension. Long recording sessions could be exhausting, especially with the exacting standards Benny maintained. Frida, however, could respond without defensiveness or ego. She absorbed feedback, adjusted phrasing, and sometimes suggested improvements that even Benny hadn't considered. This balance of trust and challenge kept the creative spark alive, making their work resonate far beyond the technical execution of notes and rhythms. Another essential part of their chemistry was timing. Their voices blended in a way that gave ABBA songs both immediacy and timelessness. Frida's voice could carry a melody while Benny's arrangements built around her, creating dynamic crescendos, intimate interludes, and moments of unexpected tension. The interplay wasn't formulaic. It felt alive, spontaneous, yet controlled. That duality, precision married to emotion, is what continues to captivate listeners today. Finally, it's worth noting how their creative partnership influenced the band's identity. While all four members contributed, Benny and Frida set the emotional tone. Their connection gave ABBA its soul. When they recorded together, even as the world around them changed, they maintained a consistency that became the band's signature. Fans might remember the catchy hooks, the glittering production, or the iconic harmonies, but beneath all of that was a unique understanding between two people who could translate unspoken emotion into sound. For Frida, her presence can't be ignored. Her voice, her style, and her spirit continue to inspire. She's more than a singer. She's a force, and it's time to see why the world still feels her impact. What happened to her after the band? The Frida force long before ABBA became a household name. Annie Frid Lyngstad was already learning how to face life with quiet resilience. Born in Norway in 1945 and raised in Sweden, Frida's early years were marked by hardship. She lost her mother and grandmother at a very young age, leaving her to navigate a world that could feel lonely and unpredictable. Music became her refuge, a way to express herself when words alone weren't enough. Singing wasn't just a talent, it was a lifeline. By the time she stepped into the spotlight, Frida had already honed her voice in local bands, television appearances, and solo projects. She was meticulous, focused, and driven, qualities that made her a natural fit for the exacting demands of ABBA's studio sessions. Her ability to convey emotion, even in complex harmonies or layered tracks, set her apart from many other singers of the time. It wasn't just technical skill, it was an emotional intelligence, a capacity to translate feeling into tone, timbre, and phrasing. Even after ABBA's meteoric rise and eventual dissolution, Frida's story didn't end. She continued to explore her artistry through solo albums, stage performances, and collaborations. These projects revealed a singer unafraid to experiment, willing to adapt her style while remaining unmistakably herself. She wasn't chasing fame. She was pursuing music on her own terms, balancing creativity with personal fulfillment. In doing so, she maintained a sense of dignity and independence that many celebrities lose in the glare of the public eye. Resilience became a defining feature of Frida's life. Fame brought opportunities, yes, but also scrutiny and pressure. Navigating the international stage while maintaining a private life required careful choices, and she made them. She learned to manage the delicate balance between visibility and privacy, and in doing so, she carved out a life that allowed her to grow beyond ABBA, beyond relationships, and beyond the expectations of others. Her ability to reinvent herself without losing the essence of who she was speaks to both her strength and her intelligence. Frida's voice, of course, remains central to her identity. Even decades after ABBA, her recordings continue to resonate with fans old and new. There's a clarity, warmth, and emotional depth to her singing that's difficult to describe but instantly recognizable. Whether delivering a haunting ballad or lifting a pop anthem, she has a way of making every note feel personal, authentic, and lived in. That quality is part of why her artistry endures, long after the band's final notes faded. Beyond her music, Frida's legacy is also cultural. She became a symbol of resilience for many fans who saw themselves reflected in her life story. A woman who endured hardship, achieved global success, and maintained her integrity along the way. In Sweden, she is celebrated not just for ABBA, but as an artist who shaped the country's pop music landscape. Internationally, her influence can be heard in generations of singers who study her phrasing, tone, and expressive delivery. Today, Frida's impact is as much about inspiration as it is about music. She shows that talent alone isn't enough. Dedication, resilience, and authenticity matter just as much. And while the world may remember ABBA as a collective phenomenon, Benny Andersson, the other band members, and fans alike recognize that Frida's contribution was never simply part of the group. She was and remains a force of her own. From teenage pianist to musical icon, Benny Andersson's story begins long before ABBA ever took the world by storm. Born in 1946 in Stockholm, he grew up surrounded by music, quickly developing a love for the piano that would define his life. Even as a teenager, Benny was obsessed with melody, harmony, and the way notes could tell a story without words. He joined bands, experimented with rhythms, and honed his songwriting skills in a world far smaller and quieter than the stadiums and recording studios that would later know him. Before ABBA, Benny played in a popular Swedish band called Hep Stars. This was more than a stepping stone, it was a laboratory. He learned the dynamics of working with other musicians, arranging songs for different voices, and understanding what made audiences connect with melody. It was also here that he began experimenting with combining classical influence with pop sensibilities, a hallmark that would later define ABBA's sound. These years gave him a sense of musical intuition that wasn't just about talent. It was about understanding people, emotion, and performance. By the early 70s, Benny's path converged with Bjorn Ulvaeus, and the two of them began collaborating in ways that would eventually lead to ABBA. But Benny's creative journey was never just about fame or hits. Even during ABBA's global domination, he approached music like a craftsman. He would spend hours in the studio refining a chord progression or layering harmonies until every note felt inevitable. Behind the catchy hooks and polished production was a mind that loved structure, balance, and the subtle emotional undercurrent that made ABBA songs feel alive decades later. After ABBA slowed down in the early 80s, Benny didn't stop. He took the skills, discipline, and experience he had cultivated over decades and applied them in new contexts. One of his most ambitious projects was the musical chess, co-written with Bjorn Ulvaeus and Tim Rice. Here, Benny's compositions had to carry entire narratives, evoke dramatic tension, and provide a canvas for performers to bring characters to life. It was a different kind of challenge than pop songwriting, requiring him to think not just in hooks and choruses, but in arcs, motifs, and emotional resonance over time. And Benny thrived in it. Benny also continued to experiment with recordings and collaborations. He explored solo albums, often focusing on instrumental pieces that allowed his piano and keyboard skills to shine. These works revealed a side of him that many ABBA fans hadn't fully appreciated. A composer deeply in love with the textures, timbres, and possibilities of music itself. For Benny, music wasn't just about the audience. It was about exploration, discovery, and personal satisfaction. Working with Frida and Agnetha in ABBA taught him the subtle art of collaboration, but his solo work reveals how he could craft music entirely from his own vision, yet still communicate universally. Did you know that ABBA's members are not Americans? How did a group of 4 Swedes go from local performers to a global phenomenon whose music still shapes pop culture today? ABBA's journey and eternal influence, ABBA wasn't just a band. It was a phenomenon that swept across continents, languages, and generations. From their first Eurovision win with Waterloo in 1974 to their iconic performances on stages worldwide, Benny, Bjorn, Agnetha, and Frida created music that was instantly recognizable, endlessly catchy, and deeply emotional. But what made ABBA's journey remarkable wasn't just the fame or the glitter. It was how their music connected with people on a personal level, and how their influence continues to resonate decades later. The journey began in Sweden, where each member brought unique experiences and talents. Benny and Bjorn were songwriters and arrangers, shaping melodies and harmonies with precision. Agnetha and Frida were the voices, capable of delivering both clarity and depth, giving life to the compositions. Together, they found a balance between technical brilliance and human emotion, a combination that made ABBA more than the sum of its parts. They weren't just performing songs. They were creating emotional experiences, capturing feelings that listeners could instantly recognize and relate to. What set ABBA apart was their ability to blend pop accessibility with musical sophistication. Behind the sparkling choruses and infectious hooks were meticulous arrangements, layered harmonies, and an understanding of how dynamics affect emotion. Benny's keyboards, Bjorn's guitar, and the intertwining of Agnetha and Frida's voices gave the music a texture and complexity often unnoticed by casual listeners, but that made the songs enduring. Even today, musicians analyze ABBA tracks to understand how they created such memorable, emotionally resonant pop music. Their influence went beyond music. ABBA became a cultural touchstone, defining a moment in history while remaining timeless. Their fashion, performances, and public personas left an imprint on popular culture. And despite their immense fame, they were able to maintain a sense of authenticity. The group's focus was always on the music, the production, and the emotion behind it. This dedication gave ABBA credibility that many pop acts struggled to achieve, even decades later. Even after the band officially stopped recording in the early 80s, their songs continue to thrive. Musicals like Mamma Mia and its film adaptations introduced ABBA to entirely new audiences, proving that their music wasn't bound to a specific era. Each generation discovers something fresh in their songs, a melody that lifts the spirit, lyrics that capture love or longing, or harmonies that seem impossibly perfect. The songs are alive, evolving in meaning for each listener. What also keeps ABBA eternal is the authenticity and professionalism of the members. They never relied on gimmicks or drama to maintain relevance. Every performance, every album, was a result of careful craftsmanship and dedication. Benny and Bjorn's songwriting, combined with Agnetha and Frida's vocal interpretations, created a blueprint for how pop music could be both commercially successful and artistically sophisticated. That balance is rare, in part why ABBA's influence persists in contemporary pop, electronic, and even theatrical music today. The emotional depth of ABBA's music also plays a huge role in their lasting impact. Songs about love, heartbreak, hope, and joy are universally relatable because the emotions behind the music are real. It wasn't about writing hits. It was about depicting human experience through sound. Listeners worldwide, from Sweden to Japan to Brazil, find the sincerity of those melodies and harmonies a reason why ABBA remains far more than a nostalgic act. Timeless storytellers through music. Do you know any of their songs? Here's